I'm so glad you came back. I'm really excited about our project today. I'll tell you a little bit about it as I'm getting ready. I have been drawing since I could hold a crayon. And so I've spent a lot of time observing details when I'm drawing things. And the lesson today is going to be some things that I learned when I considered being a medical illustrator. So we'll get to the details. Let me get ready. Much better. So I'm gonna bring the prop I made. Come with me. Okay, before we get started on the project today, which will be doing pastel eyes, and it sounds complicated, but this prop is really gonna help us. I'd like to first, as usual, have a doodle warm up. Because we want to get really comfortable with drawing circles today with pastel on tinted paper, I want you to get out your Sharpie or any permanent marker, some newsprint or the back of wrapping paper. This is just doodle. This is just the warm-up. This doesn't really matter. Just be sure that the layers are thick enough that the permanent marker doesn't bleed through to your final working surface. I used blue painter's tape, super easy. And I just want you to practice becoming confident with making circles. With the eye itself, we're going to be working on the outer part of the eye and then the circumference of the iris and the circumference of the pupil. So all of this warm up is just going to get you comfortable with eyeballing, literally, nice clean circles. Pastels are very forgiving. We can wipe away our mistakes. So we're going to do a lot of sketching today, but I want you to just kind of shake out the bugs and get really comfortable with the idea of making a circle. And if you want to do some crosshatch just to warm up that set of muscles too, go right ahead. Remember, this is just your sketch pad. This is a place where you lay out the paper and you warm up your creative muscles and you warm up the muscles in your hand and you warm up your eyes to balancing out what's going on in your hand and what's going on in your head and what it is you want to tell in your story. Okay, now that we're warmed up, I feel like I'm ready to be more creative and commit to lines and be comfortable. I can remove my practice doodle sheet and set that aside for the next project because I'm going to use it over and over again. Set aside the permanent marker and talk to you a little bit about the prop that I created. So I used this globe from a big box home goods store, and I thought it would be nice to explain to you the structure of an eye. We take it for granted that it's a bulb, but if you've ever studied anatomy, what you're going to find under a microscope is that the white of the eye is roughly twice the diameter of the actual iris, which is the colored part of the eye, and the pupil itself is really a hole. And it's important to know that because when we're going to draw eyes, you'll keep in mind that this isn't just a flat surface. You want to indicate that there's a return to it and that there's a drop shadow. So I just made this because I wanted it to be the inspiration for the structure of the eye, but I'm going to talk about some nice, quick and easy ways to find the anatomy and balance out eyes. They're always one of those things that I see portrayed in street art and people's personal art, and I think that everyone that I have ever worked with loves well-rendered eyes. So I thought, why not teach you guys today some tricks that I learned when I was studying to be a medical illustrator. I learned from observation, and I learned from just loving the idea of making different eyes, different settings, different shapes, different colors. And so I decided that chalk pastels would be a nice way to do it on this tinted paper, kind of like what I've done with Pokemon portraits before, because it's forgiving and we can use that exercise we did earlier to find the anatomy. There's a couple things that you can use as a general rule, but humans are not always going to fall into those rules. So there's general rules, and then when you're observing someone, if you want to copy their eyes, you're going to find that these rules don't always apply. But if you want to make up eyes, as we are going to do today, then by all means you can use this kind of measurement rule. So I like to get started with like a medium tone color that will help me find the shape of the eyes themselves. So I'm going to pick, let's see, a kind of warm, oh, that's metallic, I don't want that. Kind of a warm, maybe an orange, just to find my shapes. So generally, the width of a face is 5 eye widths. So you'd have the side of the eye, nose, eye, side of the head. And then that makes up a face. Since we're just doing the eyes, we just have to account for kind of splitting this into 3s. So say I want the eyes to be on center. I'm going to find the length of that and make sure. So this is just going to give me my general idea. Then I'm going to split this with a sketched line in half, right down where the nose would be. And I'm going to kind of just score a horizon line. Just so this is for bearing. We can wipe it away later, but it's going to give you bearing. So eye, nose, eye. I'm kind of letting the side of the face not really be part of this. It's really just about drawing the eyes. And to get started, you want to keep in mind, okay, so say this is one of my eyeballs. I can take what I was doing in practice and very lightly indicate an eye here. I'm going to do the same here. If I'm concerned that I'm not matching the radius, I can take any kind of ruler, or as I'm using a brush, and kind of check like a clock. All right, where do my marks exist? There. And I'm going to find the center, and there, and there. And then use that as my guide for the actual eyeball. So this little quick sketch is indicating the sphere of the eyeball, the white. And then for the iris, I'm going to switch to a slightly darker color so that it stands out. I'm going to find roughly half of this. I can take my hand and do it this way and mark. And then again, I'm just going to find that shape. And do this if I want it to be the same. And again, I'm going back to that thing that I did in the warm-up just to find that shape. All right. This is just to give you the general architecture and anatomy and placement of how the two eyeballs will be. Then what happens next, because I don't want just these bulging eyeballs, I want to indicate the eyelids and find a more human aspect, so I can find the brow bone and all the other things. So generally, you're going corner to corner. The outer tear duct is going to line up with the outer edge of the white of the eye. The inner tear duct will be a little bit lower than the horizon line because the tears have to drain down, and a little bit past. So if I wanted to kind of indicate this, I would then find the arch going over my eye. In the case of this eye is wider open. If you want to do a sleepier eye or a more relaxed eye, you can cut across that iris and it'll seem more relaxed. So why don't we, just for the sake of after bringing it up, let's get it a little bit more relaxed like that. Again, to the corner, cut over here, and the tear duct is going to be just inside and beyond the white of the eye because the tears have to drain down. So the outer corner is up, the inner corner is slightly down. Then more often than not, unless your eyes are really wide open, that bottom lid is going to brush on or just above the iris. And we're going to just do a little hook here for that tear duct. And so I'm going to do the same with this side. And so what you're finding is I've started to find the anatomy and the placement of the eyes just with the math. This is just general eyes. These aren't specific, but you could take this and then tweak it a bit as you're looking at your subject and find, oh, well, maybe they're slightly different and the bridge of their nose is narrower than the width of their eye. That can happen, but this is the general idea. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, this is a sphere behind this lid structure. So different people have different eyelids. Sometimes, like with mine, the eyelids aren't really very apparent, and the brow bone is not apparent because the fat pad over my eye is thicker. So you don't have a really deep groove above my eye. But other people can have eyes that are set back and then their brow bone is deeper and the fold in their eye is deeper. So just for the sake of what I've drawn here, I'm going to kind of play it as though this particular eye follows the brow bone more closely than mine, and the fat pad is not as thick as mine. So I'm just indicating in here what the lid would be doing. Then finding the pupil, because it's good to kind of get your bearing. Pupils, of course, they dilate and they open up bigger when it's dark, and then they contract when it's bright out to protect the workings of your eye. I'm just going to kind of do a medium, and again, what we did before, I'm just finding that center like I did and finding the eye. As we move along in this drawing, we want to consider, where is the light coming from? I am going to choose to have the light coming from the upper left here. So if it hits this eyeball, like hitting this, you can see my studio lights here. See that mark? That's going to be the highlight on the eye itself. So each eye has similar highlight. So I'm going to indicate it now so I don't forget about it. I'm just going to keep it this kind of simple shape. That way I have it. If you want to bounce a little light down here, you can keep that in mind. But that just kind of, that's a placeholder for me for later so that I remember I was coming from the upper left with my light. Now, as I showed you, and it was important to show you, the pupil is a hole. It's not a solid disc. So that means when that light is coming this way, the shadow inside this part of the hole is going to be the darkest. And it's going to bounce a little on that edge on the inside here, because it's like a kind of a tube. So that being said, when I go to darken the pupil themselves, I'm going to be pretty generous with pigment on that lower edge. And then just start finding the shape itself. I'm dealing with light coming this way. There's also a shadow that's going to be dropped by the eyelid itself. And that will make it darker in the top of the pupil as well, because now, like an awning, that lid is going to drop a shadow here. So the real bounce inside the pupil is going to really just be right about here, right where that light is going. Just for later, something to keep in mind. Now, the other thing about the anatomy of an eye is, more often than not, you're going to see an indication of the muscles. This is a circular structure of muscles that can contract to make the pupil small, and they can dilate to make the pupil big. When they dilate, these muscle strands shorten and the pupil opens up. More often than not, you're going to see striation in people's eyes if you look really carefully, but depending on how much pigment is in their eye, it can be hard to see those striations. I'm going to do a brown eye because I have blue eyes. I see blue eyes every day. So I thought it would be fun to, like my model, do a brighter undertone and then drop in the dark so that I can kind of play up the striations. And you can do the same thing with yours or pick a different color but I like to start with a lighter color and sort of zigzag it and indicate those muscles. And I just stay inside my circle, and I'm not going to worry about shadow just yet. I'm just trying to get this one color that's going to be the lightest color indicated on here. And then, for the sake of creating depth, I'm going to really define the outer edge of my iris, like so. Now, again with the lid, we're going to have an effect with that lid of creating more shadow on this upper part of the iris. So the iris isn't going to be as bold and bright up here because it's in shadow of the awning of the eyelid. So I'm going to take a slightly darker color and make sure that I kind of place hold all that. Which then brings me to the whites of the eye. The colored paper is wonderful because it's already providing my middle tone. Love that. That's why I love working with this. And it will allow me to decide what the biggest pops are by applying them. Sometimes when you work on white paper, you can leave the white exposed and that could be your highlights. But I like this because my medium tone is down, and then I'm going to bring up the deep darks and the bright whites and find what it is that I'm trying to play up. So you can see that here. If you look here, I kept that white a little off, and I'm going to let the paper tell some of the shadow story there. I don't want the eyes to go too red, but I can show you how to neutralize that. Okay, so you can see what we're getting now is we're starting to actually see eyes that are believably set, that have some expression to them, and I'm starting to tell my story. The next step would be to define some of the highlights of the lids themselves, and in this case, I think that I'd like to do a darker pigment for the skin. Because it'll be really nice with these starting to go brown eyes. So I'm finding this. And see, I'm still leaving that eyeball because when you look at how muscles lay on structures and how skin lays on the muscle, the bones and the soft tissue under, like the eyeball itself, all are going to influence shadow and highlights. And if you ever have looked at someone really deeply in the eyes, there's usually a little bit of a return under the lower lid, right about the area of the eyeball itself where it's pushing back. So this sketch is still helping me, so I don't want to lose it yet because it's helping me to find what's going on under the surface, which will affect how I render form. Also, I like to use my hands for blends. If you don't worry about it. Paper towels, an old rag, a torn up t-shirt is a good way to blend. Often you have a lot of oils in your hand and it can affect how the pastels move, but for the sake of this exercise, whatever's most comfortable for you is fine. I've always put my skin oil on my drawings. It seems to work out just fine. Now I want to add more pigment to the irises themselves. Because I want it to be more saturated. because I kind of just work back and forth and find what it is I'm trying to say and do with my art. And so for me, I like to blend a lot. I'm gonna leave the pupil part of the eye just as it is for right now, because if I put my finger in that and in the color, it's going to start muddying everything. So I'm just trying to stick with just the iris and kind of just creep up on that pupil edge so it has that effect that I want, that looks like it's. And if you're like me and you've used your hand, I highly recommend you wipe off some of the excess before you tackle the pupil itself. I'm blending with my hand on this. And I like the fact that it's not solid. I'm starting to get a nice depth in that. Then there's another thing that's important to note, and that is the upper lid, before we do lashes, has a thickness to it, but you don't often see that turning edge so much. But I'm going to indicate it with this color because I'm going to have a little fun with palette here. So that's indicating that upper edge, just a little tiny bit. And then the lower edge, I'm going to make a little thicker because you do see more of the lower edge of an eye. And then in the corner, and you can take a look at your reference, there's a little cluster of tissue that makes up your tear duct. So I'm kind of just indicating that. And again, we're just working with balance, trying to get that balance of what would happen between the eyes. The setting is nice. Again, humans are different, and this is general, but there are always exceptions. And if you're trying to do a portrait of someone you know, it's a good idea to actually measure their face and the proportions and then scale that up or down according to your drawing. So this is basically my tutorial in a good way to approach doing a portrait of just eyes. And I hope that my prop that I built helps you better understand the anatomy that we're going for to get the balance to begin the process. And then if you're working from a subject, knowing these fundamental rules, which can be broken, will help you when you're observing somebody up close and wondering, okay, where is the shadow there? You can use that to your advantage when you're doing a portrait, but you can also use this whole structure to your advantage to just be creative and make a pair of eyes and let them tell the story you want to tell. Thank you again for joining me on Blonde Ross, the joy of creativity. I love when you can come and join me in my studio and I can share something that I have worked out or learned, and I hope you join me again.